He didn't recognize the former maid until he saw her with twins girls at his wedding with his striking resemblance. The ocean breeze carried the scent of white roses and promises as Jonathan Bradley straightened his bow tie, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment when his past walked down the aisle, not as a guest, but as the woman in yellow holding the hands of two blonde girls who bore his unmistakable eyes. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The morning sun painted the Malibu coastline in shades of gold and amber as Jonathan Bradley stood before the full-length mirror in the oceanfront villa's master suite. His reflection stared back, a man who had everything the world said mattered. At 34, his angular jawline remained sharp, his brown hair perfectly styled, and his green eyes held the confidence of someone who had never known want. The white Tom Ford tuxedo hugged his athletic frame like a second skin, each thread worth more than most people earned in a month. "You're really doing this," he murmured to his reflection, adjusting the platinum cufflinks, a wedding gift from his business partner. The man in the mirror looked successful, polished, ready to marry into one of California's most prominent families. But beneath the surface, Jonathan felt the familiar hollowness that no amount of money had ever filled. His phone buzzed against the marble countertop. A text from his bride-to-be. "Can't wait to see you at the altar, darling. The Ashfords send their love. This merger, marriage, will be perfect. Hugs and kisses, Victoria." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Even on their wedding day, Victoria couldn't help but reference what this union really meant, the joining of two business empires, the Bradley tech fortune with the Ashford real estate dynasty. Love was a luxury they'd never pretended to afford each other. The irony wasn't lost on him. 6 years ago, he'd been a different man, rougher around the edges, hungry for success but still capable of genuine emotion. That was before the IPO, before the mansions and private jets, before he'd learned to see people as assets or liabilities. That was before he'd made choices that haunted his rare quiet moments. A knock interrupted his brooding. "Mr. Bradley." His personal assistant's voice filtered through the door. "The guests are arriving. Your mother would like to see you before the ceremony." "Tell her 5 minutes," Jonathan called back, taking one final look at himself. The man in the mirror looked like he belonged in this world of champagne toasts and strategic marriages. But sometimes, in unguarded moments like these, he caught glimpses of who he used to be, and who he'd lost along the way. 3 miles away, in a modest apartment complex overlooking the Pacific Coast Highway, Naomi Washington stood before a different kind of mirror. The reflection that greeted her was a study in quiet strength, high cheekbones that spoke of her grandmother's Nigerian heritage, warm brown skin that glowed despite the early hour, and dark eyes that held depths of experience most people her age never knew. Her fingers smoothed the yellow halter dress she'd chosen carefully for today. It wasn't designer, she'd found it at a consignment shop in Santa Monica, but the sunny color brought out the gold flecks in her eyes and made her feel beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with price tags. At 29, Naomi had learned to find luxury in simpler things, the perfect shade of lipstick, a dress that made her feel confident, the sound of her daughter's laughter echoing through their small but loving home. "Mommy, you look like sunshine." 5-year-old Lily bounced into the room, her blonde curls catching the morning light streaming through the windows. Behind her, her twin sister Emma followed more quietly, always the observer. "Thank you, baby girl." Naomi knelt to adjust Lily's bright pink dress, one of 2 identical ones she'd saved for months to buy. The girls looked like angels in the vibrant color, their golden hair styled in loose waves that framed faces that grew more beautiful each day. Sometimes, when she looked at them, Naomi's heart ached with how much they resembled. "Are we really going to the fancy wedding, Mama?" Emma asked, her green eyes wide with curiosity. Those eyes. Naomi's breath caught, as it did every time she saw that particular shade of emerald looking back at her. "Yes, sweetheart. Mommy has a job to do there, remember? We talked about this." Naomi stood, checking her small purse for the 100th time. Inside were the business cards for her catering company, Naomi's Kitchen, a dream she'd built from nothing after everything fell apart. The truth was more complicated than a simple catering job. When Victoria Ashford had contacted her personally, requesting her services for the wedding, Naomi had been surprised. She'd built a solid reputation in the past few years, but this was the kind of high-profile event that usually went to the established firms with celebrity clientele. "I want someone who understands discretion," Victoria had said during their meeting, her cool blue eyes studying Naomi with an intensity that felt almost predatory. Someone who knows their place and won't cause disruptions. The words had stung, but Naomi needed the money. Single motherhood wasn't cheap, and the twins were starting kindergarten in the fall. She'd swallowed her pride and accepted the job, telling herself it was just business. She hadn't told Victoria that she knew the groom. She hadn't mentioned that once upon a time, she'd cleaned his apartment, cooked his meals, and briefly, so briefly, believed that the connection between them meant something real. "Will there be other kids there?" Lily asked, twirling in her dress. "A few," Naomi said, though she wondered if any of the Ashford Bradley wedding guests had brought children. This wasn't that kind of celebration. It was the kind where networking happened over cocktails and deals were sealed with champagne toasts. But the client had specifically requested that she bring the girls. "I'd like to meet them," Victoria had said with that same calculating smile. "I'm sure they're lovely." The memory made Naomi's skin crawl, but she pushed the feeling aside. She was good at compartmentalizing now, at doing what needed to be done to provide for her daughters. 6 years of single motherhood had taught her that survival sometimes required smiling when you wanted to scream. What do you think drives someone to attend their past's wedding? Drop a comment below. Would you face your history for your children's future? All right, girls, let's go. We have a job to do. Naomi took each daughter's hand, their small fingers warm and trusting in hers. As they walked toward the door, she caught her reflection one last time. The woman looking back was nothing like the scared 23-year-old who had cleaned houses to pay for community college. This woman had built something from nothing, had raised 2 incredible children alone, had survived heartbreak and betrayal and emerged stronger. Today, she would face the man who had taught her that love and money didn't always go hand in hand. Today, she would serve canapes and smile professionally while he married someone else. And tonight, she would go home to her small apartment and count the money that would help secure her daughters' futures. She had no way of knowing that by the time the sun set over the Pacific, nothing about their lives would ever be the same again. The drive to the Ashford estate took them along the winding coastal road, past mansions that seemed to grow more opulent with each mile. The twins pressed their faces to the windows, marveling at the houses that looked like castles against the ocean backdrop. "Mommy, do princesses live there?" Emma asked, pointing to a sprawling Mediterranean villa. "Different kind of royalty, baby," Naomi murmured, thinking of the tech moguls and entertainment executives who called this stretch of coastline home. She'd cleaned houses in neighborhoods like this during her college years, invisible to the people who lived in them, until she wasn't. The Ashford estate materialized around a bend like something from a fairy tale, if fairy tales included private beaches and helicopter landing pads. White roses and hydrangeas adorned every available surface, creating an ethereal backdrop against the Pacific's endless blue. Staff members in crisp uniforms directed guests toward the ceremony area, where white chairs arranged in perfect rows faced an altar adorned with cascading flowers. Naomi parked in the service area and took a steadying breath. Through the ornate gates, she could see guests arriving, women in designer gowns and men in tailored suits, all moving with the easy confidence of people accustomed to luxury. This was Jonathan's world now, the life he'd chosen after. "It's so pretty, Mama." Lily's excited voice pulled her from the dangerous territory of memory. "Yes, it is," Naomi agreed, forcing brightness into her tone. "Now remember what we talked about. Stay close to Mommy, use your inside voices, and be good helpers," both girls chorused, a phrase that had become their motto during the catering jobs where childcare wasn't an option. As they gathered the supplies from her car, Naomi's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Kitchen setup complete. Guests arriving now. Victoria wants to see you before ceremony starts." A chill ran down Naomi's spine despite the warm morning air. In all her catering jobs, she'd never had a bride request a personal meeting right before walking down the aisle. Something felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on what. "Ready, girls." She took their hands again, drawing strength from their small fingers intertwined with hers. As they walked through the service entrance toward what might be the most important day of their lives, none of them could have predicted that the next few hours would reveal truths that had been buried for 6 long years. Truths that would change everything they thought they knew about family, love, and the price of the choices we make. The ocean breeze carried more than the scent of roses now. It carried the weight of destiny, pulling them all toward a moment that would redefine the meaning of recognition, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds between parents and children. The ceremony was 20 minutes from beginning when Victoria Ashford soon-to-be Bradley stood in the bridal suite, studying herself in the antique mirror that had belonged to her grandmother. The reflection showed perfection: platinum blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, makeup applied by Los Angeles' most sought-after artist, and a Vera Wang gown that had cost more than most people's cars. Everything was exactly as it should be for the society wedding of the year. Yet something felt incomplete. Her wedding planner appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. "The caterer you requested is here. Should I send her up?" Victoria's lips curved in a smile that never reached her ice-blue eyes. "Perfect. Yes, send her up immediately." As the wedding planner disappeared, Victoria turned back to the mirror. In 30 minutes, she would walk down the aisle toward Jonathan Bradley, handsome, wealthy, and completely unaware of what today would really cost him. She'd spent months orchestrating this moment, and now all the pieces were finally falling into place. Down in the service corridor, Naomi smoothed her yellow dress one final time as she waited outside the bridal suite. The twins stood beside her, their matching pink dresses bright spots of color against the mansion's neutral palette. Lily clutched a small bouquet of white roses, a prop Victoria had specifically requested, while Emma held her mother's hand with the quiet intensity she'd inherited from someone. "Mrs. Washington." A stern-faced woman in a black suit appeared. "Mrs. Ashford will see you now." Naomi's stomach tightened. "Girls, remember what we talked about." The bridal suite was a study in understated luxury: cream silk wallpaper, fresh peonies in crystal vases, and a view of the Pacific that probably cost more per month in property taxes than Naomi made in a year. Victoria stood with her back to them, studying her reflection with the satisfaction of someone who had never questioned whether she deserved everything she had. Perfect timing. Victoria turned, and Naomi was struck again by how beautiful the woman was, in the cold, calculating way of someone who had weaponized their appearance. "And these must be your daughters." Victoria's gaze lingered on the twins with an intensity that made Naomi's protective instincts flare. "Yes, this is Lily and Emma. Girls, say hello to Mrs. Ashford." "Hello," both girls chorused politely, though Emma pressed closer to her mother's leg. "Remarkable," Victoria murmured, circling them slowly. "Absolutely remarkable. They're exactly as I imagined." She paused in front of Emma, studying the little girl's green eyes with scientific precision. "Those are some very distinctive features you have there, sweetheart." "Victoria," Naomi said carefully, "if you could tell me what you need for the reception." "Oh, we'll get to that." Victoria waved dismissively. "First, I have a special job for you. I'd like you and the girls to stand near the altar during the ceremony. You know, add some color to the proceedings." Naomi's blood chilled. "I'm sorry, what?" "It's not a request." Victoria's voice hardened, though her smile remained fixed. "You see, Naomi, may I call you Naomi? I know exactly who you are. I know about your history with my soon-to-be husband, and I know about the timing of your daughter's births." The room seemed to tilt. Naomi felt Emma's small hand tighten in hers, sensing her mother's distress even if she couldn't understand it. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Victoria moved to her dressing table, retrieving a manila folder with the casual confidence of someone revealing a winning hand. 6 years ago, you worked for Jonathan. You cleaned his penthouse apartment 3 times a week for approximately 8 months. During that time, you also provided additional services. Heat flooded Naomi's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I was never inappropriate with Mr. Bradley." "Oh, I'm sure you told yourself it was love." Victoria's laugh was like crystal breaking. A lonely young man, working all hours to build his company. A beautiful young woman, struggling to pay for school. How romantic. Naomi wanted to grab her daughters and run, but Victoria was blocking the only exit. "What do you want?" "I want justice. You see, Jonathan has no idea that his little fling resulted in consequences." Victoria's gaze swept over the twins again. "He thinks you simply disappeared one day. He never knew you were pregnant, did he?" The truth hit Naomi like a physical blow. After all these years, after convincing herself that Jonathan had chosen his money over her, the reality was somehow worse. He didn't even know about the girls. "You're going to stand near the altar," Victoria continued. And you're going to let him see what has been missing. Let him see what his choices cost him. And then, after the ceremony, you're going to disappear again. Permanently, this time. You're insane. Naomi pulled both girls closer. I won't be part of your sick game. Oh, but you will. Victoria opened the folder, revealing photographs. Naomi leaving her apartment, the girls at their daycare, images of her small catering business. Because if you don't, I'll make sure you lose everything. Your business, your apartment, your custody of those girls. I have lawyers who could tie you up in court for years, and we both know you can't afford to fight me. Lily tugged on her mother's dress. Mama, what's wrong? Naomi looked down at her daughters, innocent, trusting, completely unaware that their world was about to shatter. Nothing, baby. Mama's just talking to the lady. Wonderful, Victoria said, snapping the folder shut. I'm so glad we understand each other. The ceremony begins in 15 minutes. I suggest you find your places. The wedding guests had assembled in perfect rows, their designer clothes creating a tapestry of muted elegance against the ocean backdrop. Jonathan stood at the altar, his hands clasped behind his back, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in his chest that had been growing stronger all morning. The string quartet began the processional, and heads turned expectantly toward the mansion. This was it, the moment that would seal his fate, binding him to a woman he respected but didn't love, cementing a merger that would make both families even wealthier. He'd made peace with it, or so he told himself. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, not if he wanted to maintain the empire he'd built. Not after the last time he'd let his heart make decisions for his head. The first bridesmaid appeared, Victoria's sister, elegant in champagne silk. Then another, and another, each one a vision of carefully orchestrated perfection. Jonathan smiled and nodded at appropriate moments, playing his part in the elaborate performance. But then, in his peripheral vision, he caught a flash of yellow. His head turned instinctively, and the world stopped. Standing near the edge of the ceremony area, almost hidden behind a floral arrangement, was a woman in a bright yellow dress. Her dark skin glowed in the afternoon sun, her natural hair caught the ocean breeze, and her face, God, her face was exactly as he remembered from the dreams that still haunted his quiet moments. Naomi. His heart slammed against his ribs with such force that he wondered if the guests could hear it. 6 years. 6 years since she'd vanished from his life without explanation, leaving only an empty apartment and a hollowed-out chest where his heart used to be. But that wasn't what made his breath catch and his vision blur around the edges. It was the two small figures standing beside her. Two little girls in matching pink dresses, their blonde hair catching the sunlight like spun gold. Even from a distance, even through the shock that was making his hands shake, he could see the resemblance that hit him like a physical blow. The shape of their faces. The set of their shoulders. The way the smaller one tilted her head to look up at Naomi, exactly the way he did when he was thinking. And their eyes. Even from 20 feet away, he could see the unmistakable green of his own gaze looking back at him. "Oh God," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. The older woman beside him, Victoria's aunt, leaned closer. "Everything all right, dear?" But Jonathan couldn't answer. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't do anything but stare at the impossible tableau before him. The woman he'd never stopped loving and the two children who bore his features like a genetic signature he couldn't deny. The music swelled, signaling Victoria's imminent entrance, but Jonathan's world had narrowed to that yellow dress and those pink ones, to the truth that was rewriting everything he thought he knew about the last 6 years of his life. Naomi's eyes met his across the crowd, and he saw his own shock reflected there, mixed with something that looked like fear. One of the little girls, the one with his stubborn chin, tugged on her mother's hand, saying something he couldn't hear. Naomi shook her head, her gaze never leaving his, and he could see her lips form a single word, no. But it was too late for no. Too late for denial or explanation or anything but the devastating truth that was crashing over him like the waves against the rocks below. He was a father. He had been a father for years, and he'd never known. Have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything you thought you knew about your life? Share your thoughts below. How do you even begin to process a moment like this? The realization hit him in waves, each one more devastating than the last. The timing aligned perfectly. Naomi had disappeared 6 years ago, and the girls looked to be about 5. The math was simple, brutal, undeniable. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, and he gripped the altar's edge for support. The officiant, a family friend who'd known him since childhood, noticed his distress. "Jonathan. Son, are you all right?" But Jonathan couldn't form words. His throat had closed, his chest felt crushed, and all he could do was stare at the family he'd never known he had. Naomi took a step backward, pulling the girls with her, but there was nowhere to go. The ceremony area was surrounded by guests, staff, and the elaborate staging that had taken months to plan. She was trapped, just as surely as he was, trapped by the truth that had finally broken free after 6 years of silence. The little girl with his eyes, Emma, though he didn't know her name yet, looked directly at him with the unself-conscious stare that only children possessed. She whispered something to her sister, who looked at him too, and Jonathan felt his heart shatter and remake itself in the space between heartbeats. They were beautiful. They were perfect. They were his. And he'd missed everything. First steps, first words, first days of school, stolen by circumstances he was only beginning to understand. The wedding march began, and guests rose to their feet in anticipation of Victoria's entrance. Jonathan forced himself to turn toward the mansion, but his hands were shaking so violently that he had to clasp them behind his back to hide the tremors. Victoria appeared in the doorway, a vision in white silk and diamonds, her face radiant with what he now recognized as triumph rather than joy. She'd orchestrated this moment, he realized with dawning horror. Somehow, she'd known about Naomi, about the children, and she'd planned this revelation for maximum impact. As she glided down the aisle toward him, her eyes met his with a satisfaction that made his stomach turn. This wasn't about love or even business, it was about power, about control, about watching him break in front of everyone who mattered in their world. But as Victoria drew closer, Jonathan's gaze kept drifting back to the woman in yellow and the two little girls who held his heart in their small hands. Naomi's face was a mask of barely controlled panic, and he could see her calculating escape routes, protective instincts warring with whatever force had brought her here today. The music reached its crescendo as Victoria took her final steps toward the altar. The officiant gestured for the guests to be seated, and in the rustle of expensive fabric and whispered comments, Jonathan heard one of the little girls say something that made his chest constrict. "Mama, why is that man staring at us?" And Naomi's whispered response, carried on the ocean breeze, "Because sometimes, baby, the past catches up with us whether we're ready or not." Victoria reached the altar and took her place beside him, her gloved hand finding his arm with possessive certainty. But Jonathan's attention was entirely focused on the woman and children who represented everything he'd lost without even knowing it was gone. The officiant began the ceremony with words about love and commitment, about the sanctity of marriage and the bonds that could never be broken. But all Jonathan could think about was the bond he'd never had the chance to form, the connections that had been severed before he even knew they existed. As Victoria began to recite her vows, words about devotion and partnership that rang hollow in the salt-sweet air, Jonathan found himself memorizing the faces of his daughters. The way the smaller one bounced slightly on her toes, full of restless energy. The way the older one watched everything with serious eyes that mirrored his own. They were strangers to him, and yet they were everything. When it came time for his vows, Jonathan's voice cracked on the first word. He cleared his throat, tried again, but the prepared speech about mutual respect and shared goals felt like ash in his mouth. Because 20 feet away stood the only woman he'd ever loved and the children who should have been standing beside him as his family, not hidden among the flowers like secrets too dangerous to acknowledge. The ceremony continued around him, but Jonathan was drowning in a sea of what ifs and why didn't I knows. Every smile he forced felt like a betrayal, every word he spoke felt like a lie, and every glance toward Naomi and the girls felt like coming home and saying goodbye all at once. As the officiant asked if anyone had objections to the union, Jonathan's heart screamed 1,000 protests, but his voice remained silent. The moment passed, and with it, perhaps his last chance to stop the elaborate charade that was about to make him a married man while his real family watched from the shadows. But even as the ceremony moved toward its inevitable conclusion, Jonathan knew that this was just the beginning. The truth had been unleashed, and there would be no containing it now. The woman in yellow and the girls in pink had changed everything, just by standing there and breathing and existing in his line of sight. And as Victoria lifted her veil for their first kiss as husband and wife, Jonathan's eyes were still locked on the family he'd never known he had, and the future that had just become infinitely more complicated than he'd ever imagined possible. The kiss that sealed Jonathan and Victoria's marriage lasted exactly 4 seconds, long enough for the photographer to capture the perfect shot, short enough to feel like the closing of a coffin lid. As they turned to face their guests, hands raised in victory, Jonathan's smile felt like it might crack his face in half. The applause was thunderous, a wall of sound that seemed to echo off the ocean itself. Rice flew through the air in elegant arcs, and somewhere a champagne cork popped in premature celebration. But through it all, Jonathan's eyes searched the crowd until they found the splash of yellow that had rewritten his entire existence in the span of 20 minutes. Naomi was backing away from the ceremony area, the twins' small hands clutched tightly in hers. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she moved like a deer sensing a predator. She was trying to disappear again, just as she had 6 years ago. Not this time. Darling, Victoria's voice cut through his thoughts, sweet as poison honey. Her fingers tightened on his arm with enough pressure to leave marks. Shall we greet our guests? The receiving line was torture. Jonathan shook hands and accepted congratulations, his mouth moving on autopilot while his heart hammered against his ribs. Mrs. Patterson from the country club gushed about the flowers. His business partner James clapped him on the back and made jokes about ball and chains. A succession of faces blurred together, all of them strangers now that he'd seen what really mattered. All the while, Victoria stood beside him, radiant and triumphant, accepting compliments on her dress, her flowers, her perfect wedding day. But Jonathan caught the calculating glances she threw toward the reception area, the satisfied smile that flickered across her lips when she thought no one was looking. She was enjoying this. His pain, his shock, his desperation, it was all part of her elaborate revenge fantasy. Jonathan, my boy. His father-in-law's booming voice broke through his fugue. Richard Ashford was a mountain of a man, used to commanding attention and getting his way. Hell of a ceremony. Hell of a woman you married. He winked conspiratorially. The merger documents are already drawn up. We'll have this whole thing wrapped up by Monday. Merger documents. Because that's what this was, a business transaction dressed up in white silk and baby's breath. Jonathan nodded numbly, his attention already drifting back toward the reception tent where he could see glimpses of yellow moving between the servers. Excuse me, he managed, pulling away from Victoria's grip. I need to check on something. Victoria's nails dug into his wrist. Darling, we haven't finished with the receiving line. I'll be right back. The lie came easily, born of 6 years of practice at saying what people wanted to hear instead of what he meant. He strode toward the reception area with purposeful steps, ignoring the curious glances from guests who were making their way toward cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. His heart pounded harder with each step, a drumbeat of anticipation and terror that made his vision blur around the edges. What would he say to her? What words existed for a moment like this? He found her behind the catering station, directing her small staff with quiet efficiency. She tied a white apron over her yellow dress, and her hair was pulled back in a professional bun, but nothing could disguise the elegance of her movements, the grace that had first caught his attention all those years ago. The twins sat at a small table nearby, coloring in books that someone had thoughtfully provided. They looked like cherubs in their pink dresses, completely absorbed in their art, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Naomi. Her name came out rougher than he'd intended, and she froze with a serving spoon halfway to a chafing dish. Her shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. Mr. Bradley. Her voice was carefully neutral, professional. Congratulations on your wedding. The formality hit him like a slap. Mr. Bradley. As if they were strangers. As if she hadn't once fallen asleep in his arms while rain drummed against his penthouse windows. As if he hadn't traced the curve of her spine with his fingertips while she whispered dreams about the restaurant she wanted to open someday. We need to talk. I'm working. She began arranging canapes on a silver tray with unnecessary precision. Your guests are waiting for their appetizers. Naomi, please. He stepped closer, close enough to smell her perfume, something light and citrusy that brought back memories of Sunday mornings and shared coffee. The girls. They're none of your concern. The words came out sharp enough to cut, and several of her staff members glanced over curiously. She lowered her voice but kept her back to him. You made that clear 6 years ago. Confusion crashed over him like a cold wave. What are you talking about? You're the one who disappeared. You're the one who left without a word. Finally, she turned to face him, and the pain in her dark eyes nearly brought him to his knees. I left because you told me to leave. I never. He stopped, thinking back to that last day, trying to piece together memories that had been blurred by time and guilt. Naomi, I never told you to leave. You just stopped coming. Stopped answering your phone. Her laugh was bitter, broken. Your assistant called me. Said you wouldn't be needing my services anymore. Said you'd found someone more suitable. The words hit him like physical blows. My assistant. And then, with dawning horror, Victoria. Victoria was my assistant then. Naomi's face crumpled for just a moment before she rebuilt her professional mask. It doesn't matter now. What's done is done. Like hell it doesn't matter. His voice rose, drawing more attention from the catering staff. He forced himself to speak more quietly. She lied to you. I never wanted you to leave. I looked for you for months. Mama. The smaller twin, Lily, he thought, though he didn't know how he knew, appeared at Naomi's elbow, tugging on her apron. Who's that man? The question hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and unavoidable. Naomi's hand moved protectively to her daughter's head, fingers tangling in blonde curls that were so much like his own. This is. She struggled with the words, and Jonathan could see the war playing out behind her eyes. This is Mr. Bradley. He's the groom. Lily looked up at him with green eyes that were mirror images of his own, and Jonathan felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. This was his daughter. This beautiful, perfect little girl was his child, and he'd missed 5 years of her life. Are you really married now? Lily asked with the directness that only children possessed. Jonathan knelt to her eye level, his hand shaking. Yes, sweetheart. I just got married. Mama says marriage is when two people love each other so much they want to be together forever. Lily tilted her head, studying him with unsettling intelligence. Do you love your wife that much? The question was innocent, but it landed like a landmine in the space between them. Jonathan glanced up at Naomi, saw the way her jaw tightened, the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides. He couldn't lie to this child, couldn't compound the deception that had already stolen so much from all of them. It's complicated, sweetheart. Lily, come back to the table. Naomi's voice was strained. Let Mr. Bradley get back to his party. But Lily was nothing if not persistent. You have sad eyes, she announced, reaching out to touch his cheek with surprising gentleness. Like Mama sometimes. When she thinks we're sleeping. The touch of her small hand against his face nearly undid him. Jonathan closed his eyes, memorizing the moment, trying to burn it into his memory along with all the other firsts he'd missed. Lily. The other twin, Emma, appeared beside her sister, more cautious but equally curious. Mama said not to bother the wedding people. Emma. Even her voice was thoughtful, measured. She hung back slightly, but her eyes, his eyes, never left his face. You're not bothering me, Jonathan said softly. Not at all. He wanted to say more. Wanted to tell them that they were the most beautiful things he'd ever seen, that just looking at them made his chest feel like it might explode with emotions he didn't have names for. Wanted to ask about their favorite colors and their dreams and whether they liked bedtime stories. Instead, he stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement. The twins were still watching him with that unself-conscious interest that children had, but Naomi had built a wall of professional distance that felt insurmountable. We should discuss terms, she said quietly. Payment, cleanup schedule, that sort of thing. Terms. Payment. As if they were strangers negotiating a business transaction instead of... What? What were they now? What would you do if you discovered you had children you never knew existed? Drop a comment. Is there a right way to handle a moment that changes everything? Naomi, please. Just 5 minutes. Somewhere private. He gestured toward the garden path that led away from the reception area. We need to talk about this properly. There's nothing to talk about. But even as she said it, her resolve seemed to waver. You have a wife now. A new life. We don't fit into that picture. Maybe my wife isn't the one I should have married. The words escaped before he could stop them, raw and honest and completely inappropriate for a man who'd said I do less than an hour ago. Naomi's eyes widened, and he saw her glance quickly around to make sure no one else had heard. You can't say things like that, she whispered fiercely. Not now. Not ever. Why not? Because it's true. He stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to remember what it felt like to hold her. Because I've spent 6 years thinking about you every damn day. Because you're married to someone else. Her composure cracked, and for a moment he saw the woman he'd fallen in love with. Passionate, fierce, unguarded. Because those little girls over there don't deserve to be caught in the middle of whatever this is. She was right, of course. The twins were watching them with growing concern, picking up on the tension even if they couldn't understand it. Emma had moved closer to her sister, and both girls wore identical expressions of worry. "Mama." Emma's voice was small. "Are you okay?" Naomi took a shuddering breath and forced a smile. "I'm fine, baby. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. Everything was falling apart in real time. 6 years of lies and misunderstandings crashing down around them like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Jonathan." Victoria's voice cut through the air like a blade. She appeared at the edge of the catering area, her wedding dress pristine, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "There you are, darling. Our guests are asking for you." She moved with predatory grace, her eyes taking in the scene. Jonathan's desperate expression, Naomi's defensive posture, the twins watching everything with wide eyes. "I see you've met our caterer," Victoria continued, her tone light but dangerous. "Naomi, isn't it? Such lovely work you've done. And these must be your daughters." Victoria's gaze lingered on the twins with the same calculating intensity she'd shown in the bridal suite. Lily stepped closer to her mother, suddenly shy, while Emma wrapped her arms around Naomi's leg. "They're beautiful children," Victoria said, and Jonathan heard the threat beneath the compliment. "They have such distinctive features. Very striking." The subtext was clear to everyone except the girls themselves. Victoria knew exactly who they were, exactly what their existence meant, and she was enjoying every moment of the destruction she'd orchestrated. "We should get back to the reception," Jonathan said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "People will wonder where we are." "Of course." Victoria linked her arm through his with possessive certainty. "Though I do hope we'll have a chance to chat more with Naomi later. I have some suggestions about how to improve her service." The threat was unmistakable. Naomi's face went pale, but she kept her chin raised, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. "I should get back to work," she said quietly. "Girls, come finish your coloring." As she turned away, Jonathan felt something inside him break. This couldn't be how it ended, with professional politeness and veiled threats, with his daughters treating him like a stranger because that's exactly what he was to them. "Naomi, wait." He pulled free from Victoria's grip, ignoring her sharp intake of breath. "This isn't over." She paused without turning around. "Yes, it is. It has to be." "Why?" "Because she says so." He gestured toward Victoria, who was watching the exchange with barely concealed fury. "Because it's convenient. Because it's too complicated to deal with. Because they deserve better than this." Naomi's voice was quiet but fierce. "They deserve stability, security, a life that isn't built on lies and manipulation. They deserve parents who put them first, not parents who use them as weapons in whatever game you people are playing." The accusation hit home because it was true. In the space of an hour, his daughters had become pawns in a chess match they didn't understand, their existence weaponized by a woman who saw them as nothing more than leverage. "I would never use them as weapons," he said desperately. "I didn't even know they existed until today." "And whose fault is that?" The question came from behind him, and he turned to find Victoria watching them with cold satisfaction. "Really, Jonathan, if you'd been more careful about your recreational activities, none of this would be necessary." The casual cruelty of her words, the way she reduced what he'd shared with Naomi to something sordid and meaningless, made his vision blur with rage. "Don't." His voice came out low and dangerous. "Don't you dare talk about them like that." "Like what?" "Like the consequences of your poor judgment." Victoria's mask was slipping, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "Face facts, darling. You had your fun with the help, and now there are complications. But nothing that can't be managed with the right incentives." Naomi made a sound like she'd been struck, and Jonathan saw her hands clench into fists at her sides. The twins were watching the adults with growing alarm, sensing the hostility even if they couldn't understand its source. "Mrs. Victoria." Lily's small voice cut through the tension. "Why are you being mean to my mama?" The innocence of the question, The simple way she'd identified the cruelty that the adults were trying to disguise made the whole ugly scene feel even more shameful. Victoria's smile didn't waver, but her eyes went cold. "I'm not being mean, sweetheart. I'm just having a grown-up conversation with your mother about her job." "It doesn't sound like job talk," Emma said quietly, her serious eyes moving between the adults. "It sounds like the way kids talk when they're being bullies." "Out of the mouths of babes." Emma's observation hung in the air like an indictment, and Jonathan felt shame wash over him in waves. His daughters, God, his daughters, were witnessing the worst of the adult world, seeing their mother threatened and diminished while he stood by in his wedding tuxedo like a helpless spectator. "You're right," he said, kneeling down to Emma's level. "This isn't how grown-ups should talk to each other. I'm sorry you had to see that." Emma studied his face with those two serious eyes. "Are you going to make it stop?" The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. Was he going to make it stop? Was he going to stand up to Victoria, to his new father-in-law, to the entire web of obligations and expectations that had brought him to this moment? Was he going to choose his daughters over everything else he'd built his life around? "I'm going to try," he said finally, and meant it more than any vow he'd spoken at the altar. Victoria's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. How touching. The happy family reunion. She moved closer, her wedding dress rustling like snake scales. "But I think it's time we return to reality, don't you? Jonathan, our guests are waiting. And Naomi, I believe you have work to do." The dismissal was clear, but Jonathan didn't move. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time in his life, he had something worth fighting for that couldn't be bought or sold or merged into a larger portfolio. He had daughters who thought he had sad eyes. He had a woman who'd loved him enough to protect his children from the ugliness of his world, even when it meant raising them alone. He had a choice to make, and for once, the right answer was crystal clear. The only question was whether he'd have the courage to make it. Jonathan rose slowly from his crouch, his hand still trembling from the touch of his daughter's small fingers against his cheek. The wedding reception continued around them, glasses clinking, laughter floating on the ocean breeze, the string quartet playing something light and meaningless. But the world had narrowed to this moment, this choice, this crossroads that would define the rest of his life. Victoria stood 3 feet away, resplendent in her wedding gown, her blue eyes glittering with the cold satisfaction of someone who believed she held all the cards. Behind her, guests began to drift closer, drawn by the tension they could sense but not yet understand. Naomi had turned back to her catering duties, but her movements were mechanical, desperate. She was trying to disappear into the background, to become invisible the way she'd learned to do during her years of cleaning houses for people who barely acknowledged her existence. But Jonathan could see the rigid line of her shoulders, the way her hands shook as she arranged canapes that no one would eat. She was terrified, not for herself, but for the twins who sat at their small table, coloring with the intense concentration that children use to block out the confusing adult world around them. "Jonathan." Victoria's voice was honey over steel. "Our guests are waiting. The photographer wants to take pictures by the fountain." She reached for his arm, her manicured fingers ready to steer him back toward the performance of happiness they'd been staging all day. But Jonathan didn't move. "No." The word came out quiet but firm, and Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment. "Excuse me." "I said no." Jonathan looked down at her, really looked at her, and for the first time saw past the beautiful exterior to the calculating machine beneath. "I'm not going anywhere." Victoria's laugh was sharp, nervous. Several guests had stopped their conversations, sensing drama. "Darling, you're being dramatic. It's been a long day." "Has it?" Jonathan's voice carried across the reception area, drawing more attention. "Because I feel like my day is just beginning." He turned toward Naomi, who had frozen with a serving spoon in her hand. "Naomi, look at me." She shook her head without turning around. "Please don't do this. Not here. Not in front of them." "In front of who?" "My daughters." The words felt foreign and familiar all at once. "My daughters who I just met today because my wife lied to both of us 6 years ago." A collective gasp went up from the nearby guests. Jonathan's business partner James stepped forward, his face creased with concern. "Jonathan, what the hell are you talking about?" But Jonathan only had eyes for Naomi, who had finally turned around, her face a mask of pain and resignation. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said quietly. What this will cost you. What it will cost them. She gestured toward the twins, who had stopped coloring and were watching the adults with wide, frightened eyes. Lily's lower lip was trembling, and Emma had that serious, worried expression that made her look far older than her 5 years. What it will cost me. Jonathan laughed, but there was no humor in it. Naomi, I've spent 6 years thinking I'd lost the only woman I ever loved because I wasn't good enough for her. I've spent 6 years building an empire that feels like a prison, marrying a woman who sees me as a business merger, becoming someone I don't even recognize. He looked around at the assembled guests, his investors, his business partners, the social elite who moved in his circles like sharks in designer clothing. And all this time, I had daughters. Beautiful, perfect daughters who think I'm a stranger because that's exactly what I am to them. Jonathan, stop. Victoria's voice was sharp with panic now. You're having some kind of breakdown. The stress of the wedding. The stress of discovering that my wife orchestrated this whole thing. Jonathan turned on her, and several guests stepped back involuntarily. The stress of learning that you fired the woman I loved and told her I didn't want to see her anymore. The stress of realizing that you knew about my children and brought them here today as some kind of sick wedding gift. The murmur from the crowd grew louder. Victoria's face had gone pale beneath her perfectly applied makeup. I don't know what she's told you, Victoria said, gesturing dismissively toward Naomi, but you can't seriously believe. I believe her. The words came out firm and sure. I believe her because I know you, Victoria. I know how your mind works, how you see people as assets to be managed or threats to be neutralized. I know because I've watched you do it to others, and I was too selfish to care as long as it benefited me. He looked back at his daughters, who were still sitting at their little table, Emma's arm around Lily's shoulders in a protective gesture that broke his heart. But I care now. I care because they exist, and they're mine, and they deserve better than a father who chooses money over family. Daddy. Lily's small voice cut through the tension like a knife. The word hung in the air, innocent and devastating, and Jonathan felt his knees nearly buckle. She'd called him Daddy. Naomi made a strangled sound, her hand flying to her mouth. Victoria's face twisted with fury, all pretense of bridal joy abandoned. You little. Victoria started toward the twins, but Jonathan moved faster than he'd ever moved in his life, putting himself between his new wife and his daughters. Don't. His voice was deadly quiet. Don't you dare say another word to them. They shouldn't even be here, Victoria hissed, her mask finally slipping completely. This is my wedding, my day, and I won't have it ruined by your bastard children and their gold-digging mother. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Jonathan heard gasps, saw his mother-in-law cover her mouth in shock, watched his business partners exchange meaningful glances. But it was Emma's quiet voice that cut through everything else. Why is the mean lady calling Mama names? The innocence of the question, the way it highlighted the cruelty that the adults had been dancing around, made the whole ugly scene feel even more shameful. Jonathan knelt down beside the twins' table, his wedding tuxedo forgotten. Because sometimes grown-ups say hurtful things when they're scared, he said gently. But that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make the thing she said true. Lily reached out and touched his face again, her small fingers tracing the line of his jaw. You really do have sad eyes. But they're like mine. Yes, they are. Jonathan's voice cracked. They're exactly like yours. Are you really our daddy? Emma asked, her serious gaze searching his face. Mama said our daddy had to go away before we were born, but she never said why. Jonathan looked up at Naomi, who was crying silently, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched the scene unfold. I had to go away because I didn't know you existed, he said carefully. Someone told Mama that I didn't want to see her anymore, but that was a lie. I would never have wanted that. But you're married to the mean lady now, Lily pointed out with 5-year-old logic. Doesn't that mean you can't be our daddy? The question hit him like a physical blow. From the mouths of babes, his daughter had identified the central problem with devastating clarity. Jonathan stood slowly, his decision crystallizing with each heartbeat. He looked at Victoria, at the crowd of guests, at the elaborate wedding setup that had cost more than most people made in a year. Then he looked at Naomi and his daughters, and the choice became simple. No, he said, his voice carrying across the reception area. It doesn't mean that at all. He began working at his wedding ring, the platinum band that Victoria had slipped onto his finger less than 2 hours ago. It came off easier than he'd expected, as if it had never really belonged there. "Jonathan, what are you doing?" Victoria's voice was shrill with panic. "What I should have done 6 years ago." He held the ring out to her, and when she didn't take it, he set it on the twins' coloring table. "What I should have done the moment I saw them standing by that altar." The crowd was completely silent now, everyone frozen in place as they watched the drama unfold. Jonathan's father-in-law pushed through the crowd, his face red with fury. "Have you lost your mind, boy? Do you have any idea what this will cost you? The contracts we've signed, the deals we've put in place." "I don't care." Jonathan's voice was steady. "Sure. I don't care about the contracts or the deals or the money. I care about them." He gestured toward his daughters, who were watching everything with wide eyes, not fully understanding but sensing that something momentous was happening. "Daddy," Lily said again, and this time she stood up, her small hand reaching for his. "Are you staying?" The question broke him. Jonathan knelt down and gathered both girls into his arms, feeling their small bodies against his chest, breathing in the scent of their shampoo and the lingering traces of crayon wax on their fingers. "Yes," he whispered into Lily's blonde curls. "I'm staying. I'm never leaving again." Emma pulled back to look at his face, her serious eyes studying him intently. "But what about your wedding? And your house? And all your fancy things?" "None of that matters," Jonathan said, and meant it more than any words he'd ever spoken. "The only things that matter are right here." Have you ever had to choose between the life you built and the life you actually wanted? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the hardest choice is also the right one. "This is insane," Victoria's voice cut through the tender moment like a blade. "You're throwing away everything for what? A fling with the help and her illegitimate children." Jonathan stood slowly, his protective instincts flaring hot and dangerous. "Say that again," he said quietly. "You heard me." Victoria was beyond caring about appearances now, her fury boiling over. "You're destroying our future, our family's alliance, everything we've worked for, because you can't keep it in your pants. Well, congratulations, Jonathan. I hope your momentary conscience is worth bankruptcy." "My momentary conscience." Jonathan stepped toward her, and several guests moved nervously. "Victoria, I spent 6 years building a fortune. I never wanted to impress people I don't like. I married a woman I don't love to merge companies that will make money I'll never spend. And all that time, the only things that actually mattered were growing up without me because you were too selfish to tell me the truth." He gestured toward the twins, who had moved closer to Naomi, sensing the adult anger even if they didn't understand it. "Look at them, Victoria. Really look at them. They're 5 years old, and they're braver and more honest than anyone at this wedding. They deserve a father who puts them first, not one who sees them as complications to be managed." "And what about what I deserve?" Victoria's voice was venomous. "I planned this wedding, I signed those contracts, I gave up other opportunities because you promised me a partnership." "You deserve someone who loves you," Jonathan said simply. "Someone who looks at you the way I look at Naomi. Someone who can't imagine life without you. That's not me, Victoria. It never was." He turned to address the crowd of guests, who were watching the spectacle with a mixture of shock and fascination. "I'm sorry you all came here for a wedding that shouldn't have happened. I'm sorry for wasting your time and making you witnesses to something that was always built on a lie." His mother stepped forward from the crowd, her face pale but determined. "Jonathan, honey, are you sure about this? Once you walk away from this life, there's no coming back." Jonathan looked at his mother, elegant, well-meaning, but forever trapped in a world where appearance mattered more than truth. "Mom, I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He turned back to Naomi, who was standing frozen beside the catering station, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. "Naomi, I know I have no right to ask this. I know I've missed 5 years of their lives, and I know you've built something beautiful without me. But please, please don't disappear again." Naomi's composure finally cracked, and she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The twins immediately moved to her side, their small hands patting her arms in comfort. "Mama, don't cry," Lily said urgently. "The nice daddy man isn't going to hurt us." "No, baby," Naomi managed through her tears. He's not going to hurt us. She looked up at Jonathan, and he saw 6 years of pain and loneliness and fierce protective love in her dark eyes. But Jonathan, you don't understand what you're giving up. Your company, your money, your whole life. My whole life is standing right here, Jonathan said firmly. Everything else is just stuff. Victoria made a sound of disgust. You'll regret this, she spat. When you're living in some suburban track house, working a regular job, dealing with school plays and soccer practice and all the mundane bullshit of normal people's lives, you'll remember what you gave up. Jonathan smiled, and for the first time all day, it reached his eyes. Soccer practice? School plays. He looked down at his daughters with wonder. That sounds perfect. Lily clapped her hands together excitedly. I want to play soccer. Emma wants to be in a school play. I want to learn violin, Emma added quietly, then looked up at Jonathan with shy hope. Do you like music? I love music, Jonathan said, kneeling down to her level again. I'd love to hear you play violin. This is touching, really, Victoria interrupted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. But you're all forgetting something. Those children are bastards. Illegitimate. No court in the country will give a man like Jonathan custody over their mother, especially when she's... When she's what? Jonathan's voice was dangerously quiet as he stood to face his soon-to-be ex-wife. Go ahead, Victoria. Finish that sentence. Victoria's eyes glittered with malice. When she's a single black woman with no resources going up against the Bradley fortune. Face reality, Jonathan. Even if you divorce me, even if you throw away everything for this fantasy, you'll still lose them. I'll make sure of it. The threat hung in the air like poison, and Jonathan saw Naomi's face go pale with fear. She pulled the twins closer, her protective instincts overwhelming everything else. Over my dead body, Jonathan said quietly. That can be arranged, Victoria smiled coldly. My father has lawyers who eat people like her for breakfast. By the time we're done with her, she'll be lucky to keep her catering business, let alone her children. The casual cruelty of the threat, the way Victoria talked about destroying his family like it was a business transaction, made something snap inside Jonathan's chest. You want to threaten them? He stepped closer to Victoria, his voice carrying across the silent reception area. Fine. Let's talk about threats. Let's talk about the insider trading you've been doing with your father's real estate information. Let's talk about the bribes you've paid to city council members. Let's talk about all the illegal shit you've pulled that I've been quietly ignoring because I thought it wasn't my problem. Victoria's face went white. You wouldn't dare. Try me. Jonathan's smile was cold as winter. I've got documentation going back 3 years, Victoria. Bank transfers, recorded phone calls, email chains, everything the FBI would need to build a case that would put both you and your father in federal prison. The crowd murmured nervously. Several guests began edging toward the exits, not wanting to be associated with whatever scandal was about to break. You're bluffing, Victoria said, but her voice shook slightly. Am I? Jonathan pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and held it up so she could see the screen. Special Agent Martinez, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We've been golf buddies for years. Want me to give him a call? Victoria stared at the phone, her face cycling through rage, fear, and calculation. Finally, she seemed to deflate slightly. What do you want? She asked quietly. I want you to disappear, Jonathan said simply. I want you to take your threats and your lawyers and your toxic family and get out of our lives. Forever. And if I don't? Jonathan looked down at his daughters, who were watching the exchange with wide eyes, not understanding the adult complexities but sensing that their father was fighting for them. Then I make that phone call, and you spend the next 10 to 15 years learning what it's like to lose everything that matters to you. The silence stretched between them, pregnant with possibilities. Finally, Victoria straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin with the last remnants of her dignity. Fine, she said coldly. But don't think this is over, Jonathan. You'll regret this choice for the rest of your life. No, Jonathan said, looking at Naomi and his daughters with wonder and certainty. I really won't. Victoria turned on her heel and stalked toward the mansion, her designer heels clicking against the stone pathway like gunshots. Several guests followed her, unwilling to be associated with the Bradley name after the scene they'd just witnessed. But Jonathan didn't care. He knelt down beside his daughters again, gathering them into his arms as Naomi watched with tears streaming down her face. "So what happens now?" Lily asked with 5-year-old practicality. Jonathan looked up at Naomi, his heart in his eyes. "That depends on your mama," he said softly. "If she'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life making up for the time we lost." Naomi knelt beside them, completing their circle, her hand finding his cheek the way she used to all those years ago. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "Are you absolutely sure? Because they can't go through losing you again. I can't go through losing you again." Jonathan covered her hand with his, pressing it against his face, anchoring himself to this moment, this family, this love he'd been too foolish to fight for the first time. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said. "I love you, Naomi. I love our daughters. And I'm done letting other people make decisions about what matters to me." Emma, practical and serious even at 5, looked between her parents with those two wise eyes. "Does this mean we're a family now?" she asked quietly. Jonathan and Naomi looked at each other, 6 years of pain and separation and misunderstanding finally giving way to something that felt like hope. "Yeah, baby," Naomi whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I think it does." As the sun began to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jonathan Bradley held his real family for the first time. The wedding guests dispersed, the elaborate reception sat abandoned, and somewhere in the mansion, his ex-wife was probably planning her revenge. But none of that mattered. Nothing mattered except the weight of his daughters in his arms, the warmth of Naomi's hand in his, and the knowledge that he'd finally chosen love over everything else. For the first time in his adult life, Jonathan Bradley was exactly where he belonged. 6 months later, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the modest 3-bedroom house in Santa Monica as Jonathan Bradley, former tech mogul, current father of 2, attempted to braid his daughter's hair for the first time. Emma sat patiently on the bathroom counter, her blonde curls twisted into something that looked more like abstract art than a hairstyle, while Lily bounced impatiently by the door. "Daddy, you're doing it wrong," Lily announced with the brutal honesty that only 5-year-olds possessed. "Mama makes it smooth. Yours looks like a bird's nest." Jonathan caught his reflection in the mirror, hair mussed, designer shirt replaced with a paint-stained t-shirt that read "World's Okayest Dad," a Father's Day gift from the twins, dark circles under his eyes from staying up late to help Emma with a school project. He looked tired, stressed, and happier than he'd ever been in his life. "Your sister is right," he admitted, gently untangling the mess he'd made of Emma's hair. "I'm still learning." Emma turned to face him, her serious green eyes, so much like his own, studying his expression with the intensity she brought to everything. "Learning is okay, Daddy. Mama says the best things take practice." The simple wisdom of it hit him square in the chest, the way his daughter's observations always did. 6 months ago, he'd been worth $300 million and couldn't manage to braid hair or make pancakes without burning them or remember which twin was afraid of the dark. Now he was worth considerably less, most of his fortune tied up in legal battles with Victoria and her father, but he could tell you that Emma preferred her sandwiches cut diagonally while Lily liked hers in rectangles, that both girls inherited his stubborn streak but Naomi's kind heart. "Daddy." Lily tugged on his jeans, impatient as always. "Mama's making Saturday pancakes. The special ones with the faces." Saturday pancakes had become their tradition, along with Sunday beach walks and Wednesday evening dance parties in the living room. Simple rituals that had replaced board meetings and business dinners, ordinary moments that felt more precious than any deal he'd ever closed. "Coming, sweetheart." He abandoned the braid attempt and scooped Emma off the counter, her arms automatically wrapping around his neck in a gesture that still made his heart skip beats. The kitchen was warm with morning sunlight and the smell of vanilla pancakes. Naomi stood at the stove, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing one of his old Columbia t-shirts over leggings. She'd gained confidence over the past months, the defensive tension in her shoulders gradually melting away as she learned to trust that this wasn't temporary, that he wasn't going to disappear the moment things got difficult. And things had gotten difficult. The legal battles with Victoria's family were expensive and ugly. Jonathan's business partners had abandoned him, his social circle had evaporated overnight, and the financial press had torn him apart with headlines like "Tech Mogul's Wedding Day Meltdown" and "From Billions to Broke, the Bradley Breakdown." But as he watched Naomi flip a pancake shaped like a smiley face, as he heard his daughter's giggles echoing through their small house, He couldn't bring himself to regret a single moment of it. "Morning, beautiful," he murmured, wrapping his arms around Naomi's waist from behind and pressing a kiss to her neck. She leaned back against him, solid and warm and real. "Morning. How'd the braiding lesson go?" "About as well as you'd expect," Jonathan admitted. "I may need to YouTube some tutorials." Naomi's laugh was rich and full, nothing like the careful, professional tone she'd used during those early weeks when she was still waiting for him to come to his senses and return to his old life. "Daddy's hair looks funny too," Lily observed, climbing onto her booster seat at their small kitchen table. A far cry from the massive dining room in his Malibu penthouse, but infinitely warmer. "That's because Daddy stayed up too late helping Emma with her volcano project," Naomi said, shooting him a look that was equal parts fond and exasperated. "You know you don't have to be perfect at everything immediately, right?" It was an ongoing conversation between them. Jonathan's perfectionist tendencies, honed by years of high-stakes business deals, had transferred directly to fatherhood. He approached parenting the way he'd once approached hostile takeovers, with intensive research, detailed planning, and an absolute determination to succeed. The problem was that children, unlike quarterly reports, couldn't be optimized. "I know," he said, though they both knew he was still learning to believe it. "But I missed so much already. I want to make up for lost time." Emma looked up from the coloring book she'd brought to the table. "Daddy, you can't make up for time. Time isn't like a broken toy. It just goes." Once again, his 5-year-old daughter had managed to articulate something that had taken him months to understand. You couldn't reclaim the past, couldn't undo the years of separation and misunderstanding. You could only build something new from where you were. "You're right, Em," he said, settling into his chair across from her. "But I can make sure I don't miss any more." Naomi placed a stack of pancakes in front of him, regular ones, not the decorated versions the girls got, and her fingers lingered on his shoulder for a moment, a small gesture of affection that still made his chest tight with gratitude. The morning continued with its familiar rhythm. Breakfast negotiations, Emma would eat anything, Lily was convinced vegetables were poisonous, arguments over screen time limits, and the complex logistics of getting 2 5-year-olds ready for their Saturday activities. Lily had soccer practice at 10, Emma had violin lessons at 11:30, and Jonathan had promised to take them both to the beach afterward if they finished their chores. It was chaos. It was exhausting. It was perfect. Later that morning, soccer field. Jonathan stood on the sidelines with the other parents, watching Lily chase a soccer ball with the single-minded determination of a general leading troops into battle. She was fearless on the field, all flying blonde curls and grass-stained knees, completely in her element. "That's some daughter you've got there," said Maria Santos, whose son played goalkeeper. "She's got natural talent." Jonathan's chest swelled with pride. "Yeah, she does." It was still surreal sometimes, being able to say that. Having people know him as Lily and Emma's dad instead of Jonathan Bradley, tech mogul. The other soccer parents knew his story, of course. The wedding day revelation had made enough headlines, but they treated him like any other parent, concerned mainly with carpool schedules and snack rotations. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. "Victoria's team is pushing for a settlement conference next week. They want to discuss custody terms. Are you available Tuesday at 2? Jonathan's jaw tightened as he typed back, "I'll be there. But my position hasn't changed. Full custody stays with Naomi, I want legal recognition as their father, and Victoria stays out of our lives permanently." The legal battles had been ongoing for months. Victoria, true to her word, had tried to make his life hell through the court system. She'd challenged his paternity claims, despite DNA tests that proved beyond doubt that the twins were his. She'd tried to argue that his unstable behavior at the wedding proved he was unfit to be around children. She'd even attempted to get Naomi investigated by Child Protective Services, claiming she was an unfit mother. All of it had failed, but not before causing tremendous stress and eating through most of Jonathan's remaining liquid assets. His lawyers were expensive, Victoria's were relentless, and every month brought new motions, new depositions, new attempts to drag them all back into court. But watching Lily score her first goal of the season, seeing her turn toward the sidelines with a gap-toothed grin to make sure he was watching, Jonathan knew he'd fight 1,000 legal battles if it meant being here for moments like this. His phone rang. Naomi's name appeared on the screen, and he stepped away from the other parents to answer. "Hey, everything okay?" Emma's violin lesson wasn't supposed to end for another 20 minutes. "Everything's fine," Naomi said, but there was something in her voice, excitement barely contained. "But I need you to meet us at home as soon as Lily's practice is over. Don't ask questions, just come home." "Naomi, what?" "Trust me," she said, and hung up. "I think that's everything," Naomi said, appearing in the doorway. "The realtor will handle the final walkthrough with the new owners." Jonathan nodded, but didn't move toward the door. This house had been their first real home together, the place where they'd figured out how to be a family, where his daughters had taught him the difference between being successful and being happy. "Second thoughts?" Naomi asked gently. "No," Jonathan said, and meant it. "Just grateful, I guess. This place gave us time to figure out who we were together." Naomi moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "And now we get to figure out who we're going to become." They drove to the airport in the rental car, the girls chattering excitedly about airplanes and tall buildings and the new adventure waiting for them. Jonathan's phone had been buzzing all morning with messages, his lawyer confirming that the custody agreement was finalized. He was officially recognized as the twins' father, Victoria had relinquished any claims, and she was legally prohibited from contacting them. His financial advisor updating him on the sale of his remaining assets, friends wishing them well on their move. But the message that mattered most had come from Emma's new violin teacher at the New York Conservatory. "Can't wait to meet our newest student. We have big plans for her future." At the airport, as they waited to board their flight, Lily climbed into his lap and rested her head against his chest. "Daddy," she said sleepily, "are you sad about leaving?" "A little," Jonathan admitted. "But I'm more excited about where we're going." "Me too," she said. "Mama says New York has the best pizza in the world." "What do you think, Em?" Jonathan asked his other daughter, who was sitting quietly beside them, watching the planes take off through the terminal windows. Emma considered the question with her usual seriousness. "I think home isn't a place," she said finally. "I think home is the people who love you." Once again, his 5-year-old daughter had managed to articulate a truth that adults spent years trying to understand. Home wasn't the mansion in Malibu or the penthouse downtown or even the small house in Santa Monica they were leaving behind. Home was this moment, this family, this choice to keep choosing each other every single day. 1 year later, New York. The studio audience's applause was thunderous as Naomi took a final bow, flour still dusting her apron from the day's cooking demonstration. Naomi's Kitchen had become Food Network's highest-rated family cooking show, and Naomi Washington Bradley had become America's favorite chef, known for her warm personality and her ability to make gourmet cooking accessible to busy families. In the front row of the studio audience, Jonathan sat with the twins, beaming with pride as his wife. They'd had a quiet ceremony in Central Park 6 months ago, with just the girls and his mother as witnesses, waved to the crowd. Emma had thrived at the conservatory, already being talked about as a potential child prodigy. Lily had joined a competitive soccer league and was making friends with the fierce determination she brought to everything. Jonathan had started a small consulting firm, helping tech startups navigate their early growth phases. Work that was fulfilling without being consuming, that let him be home for dinner every night and soccer games every weekend. Their apartment in Brooklyn wasn't fancy, but it was filled with music and laughter and the kind of chaos that came with 2 brilliant, energetic 6-year-olds. The walls were covered with Emma's school photos and Lily's soccer trophies, with family pictures from their adventures around the city. It wasn't the life Jonathan had planned when he'd stood at that altar in Malibu, but it was infinitely better than anything he could have imagined. After the show, they walked through Central Park as the sun set over the city, the twins running ahead to feed the ducks while Jonathan and Naomi followed hand in hand. "Any regrets?" Naomi asked, echoing the question she'd asked on moving day. Jonathan looked at his daughters, laughing as they threw breadcrumbs to an enthusiastic group of ducks. He thought about the empire he'd built and then walked away from, the fortune he'd traded for something infinitely more valuable. "Only one," he said finally. Naomi's steps slowed, concern flickering across her face. "What?" "I regret that it took me so long to realize what actually mattered," Jonathan said, stopping to face her fully. "I regret the years we lost, the birthdays I missed, the bedtime stories I didn't get to read. I regret being so focused on building a fortune that I almost missed out on the real treasure." Naomi's eyes filled with tears, and she reached up to cup his face in her hands. "We can't change the past," she said softly. But we have the rest of our lives to get it right. Mama. Daddy. Lily's voice called across the park. Come see. The ducks are dancing. Emma stood beside her sister, violin case slung across her back, her serious face lit up with delight as she watched the waterfowl's elaborate courtship display. Jonathan and Naomi hurried over to join their daughters, and as they stood together watching the ducks perform their ancient ritual, Jonathan felt a peace settle over him that he'd never experienced in all his years of chasing success. This was what victory looked like. Not a bank account or a stock portfolio or a place on the Forbes list, but this moment, this family, this choice to love and be loved in return. As they walk home through the Brooklyn streets, Emma's violin case bouncing against her small back, Lily chattering about her upcoming soccer tournament, Naomi's hand warm in his, Jonathan Bradley knew he was the richest man in the world. Not because of what he owned, but because of what owned him, completely, irrevocably, joyfully. 6 years ago, he'd been a man who had everything and felt empty. Now he was a man who had everything that mattered. The difference, he realized, wasn't in what he'd gained or lost. The difference was in finally understanding that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, couldn't be sold, and couldn't be stolen. They could only be chosen, nurtured, and treasured. As they reached their apartment building, Emma tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy," she said in her serious way. "I love you." "I love you too, Em," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," she said simply. "That's what makes us a family." And in that moment, Jonathan Bradley understood that his daughter was right about more than just music and moving and the nature of home. She was right about love, too. It wasn't complicated or conditional or transactional. It was simply chosen, daily and deliberately, by people who decided that being together mattered more than being apart. It was the most important lesson he'd ever learned, taught to him by a woman in a yellow dress and 2 little girls in pink who had changed his life simply by existing. As they climbed the stairs to their apartment, their voices echoing in the stairwell, their laughter bouncing off the walls, Jonathan knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would be challenges, because that was life, they would face them together. Because that's what families did. And they were a family in every way that mattered. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.